they'll be able to realise what their achievable production for their herd is based on the time of the year. Because there's obviously a natural curve as we're seeing in milk fat production. However, most importantly, if they're able to see that their milk fat percentage is deviating away from what our predicted level is, that would indicate to us that there's possibly an issue there and that somehow they should try and rectify it, and that's when I would raise a red flag on farm.
I'm joined this week by Mike Dineen, Teagasc researcher, whose work focuses on animal nutrition, and also Chris Heffernan, who recently completed his PhD in Teagasc Moorepark. Chris's work looked at the factors affecting milk production in dairy cows under pasture management systems. Mike and Chris join us to discuss the typical reduction in milk fat during late spring and early summer, and outline some of the results from their recent research project.
The whole question around the reduction in milk fat percent, it's a really practical concern in the industry, I suppose. Every year around this time of year, I suppose, the phone starts ringing, and there's a lot of kind of queries coming on it, and it's during a time when there's a lot of milk going out the gate. So it's both a very practical but a very important economic question too. I suppose the other side of it is it's tough mentally on farmers. You're seeing your milk fat reduce, and it can be frustrating to a degree. So when we look at the literature, there's lots of really good work in the US around milk fat percent and how to maybe manage and control it. But there isn't necessarily a huge amount of experiments in pasture-based settings. So I suppose we wanted to see, could we help think through some of the reasons why it might be occurring, and are there actions within our control that we can use to alleviate it? So I suppose the first place we started was we looked at CSO data. So it's a nice thing you can access online. You can look at the recordings from bulk tank collections across the country over many, many years. And it was actually really encouraging what we saw first. That milk fat concentration or percent as a country has been increasing year on year. So in 2014, the average was 4%, but in 2023, we were up to 4.4%. And it's a really nice, encouraging trend. The second part we saw, though, was there is a consistent reduction when we go from around this time of year, kind of mid-April, through into May, June, and July. So in 2014, at a country level, we went from about 4.1 in March, April, down to 3.7 in kind of May, June, July period. In 2023, we went from about a 4.4 down to a 4. So while it's all increasing and we're not seeing as many of those maybe 3.5s or 3.75s, we're still seeing quite a similar reduction, and economically that means the same thing regardless if you're going from 4.5 to 4 or 4 to 3.5. So it was something we wanted to dig in a bit to and see can we alleviate it.
Mike, you mentioned it there. It's we're in early April now. It's always at this time of year where as you said, the queries start coming. Is it just a time of year effect? Is it just the stage that the cows are at in terms of days of milk coming towards peak production? How do you go about maybe explaining that?
Yeah, so no, it's a very kind of logical thought process, I suppose, and it's one of the suggestions that come back, I suppose, that peak milk production, high yield, potentially kind of a dilution effect, reducing our milk fat. But when we dig into it a bit, I suppose it's not necessarily the case. An important thing to highlight is that's an association. At the time of year when milk fat is reducing, we're hitting peak milk production. It's not necessarily a causative effect. When we look at studies like, say, in the US, where they milk cows 2x or 3x, or 2 times a day or 3 times a day, there's a consistent increase in milk yield when farmers do that. So milking 3 times a day increases milk yield. But we don't always see a clear reduction in milk fat. So although the cows increase their yield, their milk fat percent doesn't necessarily always go down. So that makes you wonder about the whole dilution and peak yield thought process. The other bit that's actually really interesting is work from UCD. They went out and they grabbed 1 million milk recording records across a number of years in Ireland. And they split the cows into spring calving cows and autumn calving cows. So they wanted to see what was the days in milk doing to the milk fat percent. And what they found was that it wasn't necessarily days in milk that was linked with a reduction in milk fat. So it wasn't really truly associated with peak milk yield, but it was associated with time of year. So for both groups of cows, when they hit April or May, so spring cows would have been in peak, early to mid lactation. Autumn cows would be getting closer to late lactation. Both groups had a reduction in milk fat at that time of year. So the UCD work concluded that it isn't necessarily a days in milk effect potentially, but more so an association with time of year.
That's interesting, Mike, and maybe to bring you in here, Chris, because that's maybe one of the other things farmers may be often associated with high quality second round grass, and is it a cause to reduce a milk fat percentage?
It's a common association that's kind of put out there in the industry that that second rotation grass, if we think through what they're kind of looking at, is that they're saying it's very high in quality, that it'd be rapidly digested through the rumen, and that could lead to possible drops in rumen pH. And I suppose while on paper it might necessarily make sense that that rapid grass, which could possibly have high fat levels, could lead to a reduction in milk fat concentration. From our own research, we didn't really come across that. So what we decided to do was, through the use of plot trials, we decided to look at the chemical composition of the grass during that high risk period of kind of April to June. So within the study, we did see slight changes in the level of fiber, which we would look at as NDF. However, we did see that it did stay above a kind of a 30% threshold that we would say is required to support milk fat production. And I suppose then looking within the fat or the oil composition within the grass, we did see that it didn't really exceed kind of a 4% level overall, which would kind of be a parameter that we would say above would cause a risk to milk fat concentration. So overall, we didn't really see that second rotation or third rotation grass to be as possibly detrimental to milk fat as the industry might be assuming.
What you're really saying, Chris, is it's too simplistic maybe to lay the blame solely on that second round grass. And you didn't see that when you look at the composition, and you looked at that from an April right through to kind of a June period, was it?
Yeah, exactly, all the way through. And we did see slight fluctuations, but nothing really that would concern us. And I suppose another thing that we wanted to do, because a common question or suggestion that's out there is possibly if this grass had the kind of composition that we were talking about, that maybe if you increased your herbage mass, it would have a higher fiber concentration and maybe less fat, that higher pre-grazing yields could be better for milk fat concentration. However, we decided to dig into that, and we looked at 3 different pre-grazing herbage masses. So we had a low cover at coming in around 1,000 kgs of dry matter per hectare, a moderate, which would be your target on farm, of 1,500 kgs of dry matter per hectare, and then a high at 2,000. And I suppose while we did see the lower pre-grazing herbage mass did have slightly higher fat levels, they were nowhere really close to what would concern us. And then as well, on a fiber concentration, there was really little change among the herbage masses. So I suppose what's a major concern there for us is that possibly if farmers were going down that thought process of increasing the herbage mass to try and support milk fat, in reality, probably what they're doing at the higher herbage masses is reducing grass quality, which could actually have the potential to reduce the milk production that's been achieved through those pastures.
Yeah, that's interesting, because you would often hear that, if we graze heavier covers, is it going to do away with that problem? And likewise, Chris, we would hear maybe where farmers are saying, well, maybe I'm grazing too low covers, tight on grass as we head into that second round, grazing thousands, 1100s, where ideally, as you say, we'd be up at that 14 or 1500. Did you see anything, or did you see enough there where if farmers were continuously grazing low covers, that you would be a little bit concerned about milk fat drop?
I suppose from our own research, it very much depends on the amount of pasture that's probably getting into the diet. I suppose from the pasture quality results that we looked at across the plot trials, we were very happy with the amount of fiber and the amount of fat that we saw. But what I would point out is there is the possibility at those low covers of feeding high levels of concentrate. And it's more the combination of the pasture quality results that we saw, plus the possible high starch concentrates that could possibly lead to a reduction in milk fat concentration in that particular scenario. I suppose during the time of year of April and May, it usually is a period for low average farm cover on farm. And I suppose, as you mentioned, a common method to kind of overcome the deficit in grass supply would be concentrate supplementation. Within our own studies, we decided we wanted to actually dig into that a bit. So while pasture alone, we wanted to test it with a grass only control, we also decided to look at supplementation level. So we had two other feeding levels. We had our pasture plus 2.3 kgs of concentrate, and then another feeding level of 4.6 kgs of concentrate per cow per day. So we wanted to test the grass only control all the way up. So I suppose,
and what was the effect, or did it affect the situation, Chris?
So interestingly, we actually saw no effect of concentrate supplementation level on milk fat percentage itself. I suppose when we compare that to the literature, there is a good bit of mixed results, with some people seeing a reduction in milk fat percentage as you increase the concentrate levels. But when we actually dig in a bit more into those studies, it's often that these studies would have very high starch levels in their concentrates that they're feeding, which isn't really typical of what we'd see at an industry level here in Ireland.
That was actually my next question, is affect maybe a concentrate type. Is it more important that we have well-balanced concentrates, good levels of fiber sources, the likes of your soya hulls, your beet pulps? Is that going to have an impact?
Yes, yeah, definitely. The combination of moderate starch levels combined with a good level of fiber within the concentrate, from our research, would be sufficient to not have any effect on milk fat concentration. I suppose, as well as part of our research, we decided to see if altering the concentrate composition could be used as a way to alleviate any drops in milk fat percentage. For this, one of our main things was we wanted to alter the concentrate to have a higher fiber concentration within the concentrate. And for our own research, we actually didn't see any effect of including extra fiber at the concentrate feeding levels that we were feeding. However, other research would see some bit of an effect when that is put in place. But then if we take it back to what we saw at the 4 kg feeding level, that in reality there was no issue with fiber in the diets to start with, so the inclusion of fiber probably wouldn't really come into play there.
And maybe, Mike, to come back to yourself, I see it at this time of year every year, the heading beat the milk fat drop. It's out there, it's an industry, it's kind of a promise to farmers, and it's usually around rumen buffers. Have they a role to play, and how can they maybe aid in reducing the level of milk fat percentage drop at farm level?
It is a concerning thing to see, the milk fat dropping, John. You'd like to do something to try help it. And I suppose historically, like Chris mentioned, the industry might have thought it was low levels of fiber and high levels of fat. But when we looked at that in the experiments, it didn't necessarily come true. And Chris will mention some on-farm work later on, and it was consistent there as well. We didn't see these low fiber grasses and high fat or high oil contents. So it doesn't necessarily seem to be a fiber or fat issue. So maybe it's something like rumen pH. Like these grasses are quite digestible. They're producing a lot of volatile fatty acids. So that's where the kind of question comes in: would a rumen buffer help? Surprisingly, there's very little research done on rumen buffers too in the grazing situation. There is some work from UCD. They've done a number of trials, but unfortunately, there's nothing clear cut on the buffer. In their experiments, they saw an effect on rumen pH, so they are able to stop the pH from going below a certain threshold for too long, but that didn't translate into better milk fat percent. So all of their treatments, be it a control or increasing levels of rumen buffer, they were all hovering at a 3.7% fat across their experiment. So there was nothing clear there. And in that experiment, they actually were feeding 8 kilos of concentrate and 50% wheat in the ration. So it was a very, very strong test of that situation. So it is important to mention that they did pick up a little bit of milk yield, but there was no clear effect on the buffer helping milk fat percent.
Another one which crops up at farm level is maybe the idea of offering animals voluntary access to, let it be silage, hay, straw, in that kind of mid-April period where there's transitioning from first to second round grass. Did you look at that? Or is that something that you've looked at throughout the study?
Yeah, so it's another interesting one. We didn't look at that one directly ourselves. I suppose the idea around it is what we've been discussing here, that the thought process that grass is low in fiber, the cows are deficient in fiber, they need an additional fiber source. Um, but it's kind of starting to become clear that that grass isn't actually low in fiber. It's above the thresholds nutritionally, over 30% the majority of the year. Um, so that logic is starting to break down a bit, I suppose, in our minds at least. A very interesting part of Chris's work was that grass only control he mentioned. So those cows were getting no ration, just some minerals to protect them from grass tetany and ensure we hit their mineral requirements. And those cows across a 3 month period from mid-April out to mid-July, they averaged a 4.4% fat and about 1.83 kilos of milk solids across that 3 month period. So they were on really lush, digestible, high quality grass over in Kilworth, and they maintained very good milk fat percents, I suppose. Just on directly on your question, James, about offering that additional fiber source, Mike Egan and Sarah Walsh did a nice bit of work lately. They had different objectives, but it's an interesting study to look at around this question. And inside their experiment, they fed cows a grass only control with 3 kilos of ration, or they gave the cows 3 kilos of silage on top of the 3 kilos of concentrate. And they did that from kind of mid-March out into mid-April. So kind of around this risky period. And what they found was that there was actually no benefit of adding in the silage on milk fat percent. So that additional fiber source didn't drive up milk fat or increase milk fat percent. And what it actually did was it reduced milk yield. So the cows lost a kilo of milk and they lost milk protein as well. They were down 0.1% milk protein. So the silage was high quality. It was or moderate quality, I suppose. It was a 72 DMD silage, but it was an inferior feed to pasture. And it kind of just shows us, by going in with that additional fiber source, we think we might be helping with milk fat percent, but we could be creating different issues like lower digestibility and a loss in milk yield and protein percent. So while that's silage, it's not hay or straw. I'd imagine it'd be a similar situation for hay and straw, which are typically an inferior feed to graze pasture.
I think that's an important message that, the idea, as you said, there was no positive impact on milk fat production, but there was an impact on animal performance, and that's not what we're looking for at that time of year. Chris, I know a part of your study was actually looking at the role animal genetics plays within this whole question. What did you see, or what was particularly interesting when you looked at the genetics regarding milk fat percentage?
I suppose just for the listener, I suppose within all of the nutritional studies that I carried out, we also decided to layer in a genetics level within the study. So we also tested everything we did across the genetic groups. So for this, we had 3 different genetic groups. We would have had a group of Holstein Friesian cows, which were kind of the national average for EBI. We would have had an elite group of high EBI Holstein Friesian cows, and these would have been representative of the top 1% for EBI. And then we also finally would have had a group of purebred Jerseys. And I suppose one of the take homes from the study was that, as kind of widely expected, the Jerseys would have had the highest milk fat percent, coming in at around 5.7. The elite would have had the moderate at about 4.6 and the national average coming in at around 4.2. That actually, when we look into their actual genetic makeup, so their milk fat percent PTA, interestingly, the observed percent by each of those groups matched more or less what their genetic potential was. So if we break it down even just within the Holstein breed and looked at the difference, so we would have seen a 0.1% difference in milk fat percent PTA, and that actually led to an observed milk fat percent difference of around 0.2 to 0.25. So it was nice to see the effect of genetics coming through to the observed. And when we compare that again to other works by Lahart and O'Sullivan within the next generation herd, they would have seen very similar results, that milk fat percent PTA led to a significant effect on the observed milk fat percent by the animals themselves.
It's interesting that, and the fact that commercial farm data, we would have looked at, Chris, as well, and we were not only looking at fat, but looking at protein percentage PTAs as well. We would have seen an extremely high correlation between, we'll say, genetic prediction for fat and protein percentage versus actual delivered, and we've seen correlations there in around an R-squared of 0.65, which really would tell us that something in the region of 65% of that variation is actually explained by genetics. And I suppose often where we get queries, Mike, you mentioned that the calls usually start coming at this time of year. When you actually look at maybe that herd PTA for fat percent, often it's tracking where you would expect it to be, albeit maybe not the position the farmer wants to be in. But I think that's an important point, Chris, in terms of where we want to improve fat percentage mid-season and there's nothing else wrong on farm, we need to probably be breeding stronger for our PTA for fat production, and no different for protein as well. As part of the study, Chris, you collected data, and Mike mentioned it earlier, on 25 commercial farms. What were the results from this? And I suppose, did they align with what you've seen within your own research work?
Yeah, I might just give you a bit of background about the study itself. So we conducted the study back in 2021, 2022, and the idea of the study was basically to find out kind of what associated factors we can see on farm that are actually affecting the bulk tank milk fat percentage that farmers are seeing. So as you mentioned, we would have had 25 commercial farms across the Munster, Leinster region. We went out to them 10 times to represent the 10 grazing rotations, and we did that over the 2-year period. So we collected quite a lot of data on farm. I suppose we would have taken pasture samples, silage, concentrate samples. We'd also would have taken a bulk tank milk sample to correspond with each of the feed samples. And then we would have collected a lot of management data through Pasture-Based Ireland. And basically what we wanted to figure out was what factors on farm were leading to possible reductions in milk fat concentration. So I suppose when we dig into the results, one of the main things we could take away from the study was that there was no one factor that was leading to the reductions in milk fat concentration on farms. And I suppose one thing that we did see commonly across the groups, and one thing that did dictate the observed milk fat percentage within the bulk tank, was again the herd's milk fat percent PTA. So it was interesting again to see the nutrition or the genetics coming through, and how much of that was playing and having an effect on milk fat being observed at a farm level.
But is there common, we'll say, management mistakes that you would have picked up through your work on those commercial farms?
Yeah, so it was a very interesting study, right? And I suppose we had certain objectives going out and certain, I suppose, thoughts in our heads that we'd find when we started that work. But it was very interesting, right? Like what Chris measured on those farms, and it was a lot of hard work and torture going around to all the different farms. But what we found was like the nutritive value seen on farm was reflecting what Chris had mentioned in his plots. So we weren't seeing those low fiber levels on farms. We weren't seeing those high fat levels in the second, third rotation. So there was nothing clear, as Chris mentioned, coming out there. The genetics really were the big one that were standing out, and you alluded to that one too, James. The other interesting thing that was part of the reduction in milk fat was when Chris built a predictive model to see what factors were associated with milk fat. Grazing rotation, or the month that we visited the farm, had a very strong association. So by Chris accounting for the genetics and then layering in the rotation or the month we visited, we could predict quite accurately the milk fat the farmers would be observing at that time of year. So it was saying that there's this kind of consistent seasonal pattern going on. There wasn't anything necessarily stand out from a management point of view. Of course, there's times maybe things like excessive levels of ration, high starch content in those rations, maybe wheat and barley, or potentially distillers' grains, overdoing it on that. Chris mentioned not providing enough pasture and low covers. You know, if you're tight there and you're under allocating pasture and layering in ration, there's all those kind of bits and pieces that potentially could pop up. But in the group of farmers that we visited, there was nothing like that jumping out of us. And it really seemed to be, maybe we're oversimplifying it, but it was genetics and that month that we visited, the time of year we visited them. A very interesting thing about the month part is that there's this kind of new thought process in the US where they're looking at the seasonal rhythm in milk components. So what they're finding is that regardless of like forage quality or times when there's heat stress, there's this very consistent pattern in milk fat across the year. It's a very consistent annual rhythm. And they're suggesting that some of that is out of our control. So it could be related to environmental factors like the lengthening of the day or day length. And as I mentioned, we mightn't be able to stop that proportion of the drop in the milk fat. It might be a natural thing built in. And when we're trying to cure it, and it's tempting as nutritionists, we want to find, like you mentioned, James, wanted to find the solution. There's a portion of that we mightn't ever be able to prevent, and it's a natural rhythm. So, it's a tricky one. We don't have all the answers yet, but they're just some of the learnings we've got from that big on farm and from some of Chris's work.
How does a farmer identify they have a problem rather than those acceptable milk changes? Chris, you mentioned you built a predictive model there. Is that something that farmers will be fit to tap into and use, or how would I as a farmer identify I have an issue?
As I was mentioning, kind of off the back of our commercial farm study, we decided to produce what we're calling a decision support tool for farmers, which should hopefully allow them to figure out kind of what's the achievable milk fat percentage for their herd based on the time of the year. So the tool will be very simple. It'll only require 2 pieces of input data, which will be the time of the year and the herd's genetic value for milk fat percent PTA. And kind of what our hopes for the tool is that a farmer, once they have the data and they put it in, they'll be able to realize what their achievable production for their herd is based on the time of the year. Because there's obviously a natural curve as we're seeing in milk fat production. However, most importantly, if they're able to see that their milk fat percentage is deviating away from what our predicted level is, that would indicate to us that there's possibly an issue there and that somehow they should try and rectify it. And that's when I would raise a red flag on farm. But if they're seeing a reduction, but it's kind of hitting whatever their achievable is, it probably would mean that they're maintaining or hitting what their herd is able to achieve.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. And as you say, a simple tool, but being fit to identify, is it a problem, isn't it a problem? I think that's often the biggest challenge at farm level, and it's the one we often get queries on. And when you actually look at the data, they're maybe delivering exactly as they should. So look, guys, I think that was excellent insight into your research, Chris. It covered off maybe a lot of the myths maybe around this conversation. And as you say, Mike, it is a frustrating one at farm level, but it's good to maybe cover off some of those areas where maybe farmers thought there was an issue and have a discussion on it. So thanks a million, lads.
No hassle, James. And it's great. We're able to keep Chris with the team. So Chris will be following on a lot of this work into Vistamilk 2. We'll be hoping to create that tool and get it out to the industry, and maybe dig deeper into that annual rhythm and see how is that similar here in Ireland as they found in the US. Just before we go, James, just a quick thank you to everyone. You can tell there by Chris, there was a big body of work involved in it. And just a big thank you to all the farmers that kindly allowed us onto their farms and for putting up with us for the 2 years. So we really appreciate it, and we couldn't have done it without them. And of course, the Dairy Levy funding. We hope we've generated some useful insights for dairy farmers, and hopefully it helps in the day-to-day decisions.
Well said, Mike, and congratulations, Chris, again. A big body of work, and I'm sure you were glad to finish up with the writing.
Definitely. Thanks very much, James. Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast. My thanks to Mike and Chris for joining me on this week's show. If you have any questions about this week's episode or have suggested topics you'd like us discussed, you can send them to us at the following email address: dairyedge.podcast@teagasc.ie. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm James Dunne, and join us next time for your Dairy Edge.